I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to explore compression, what it is, how it works, and what it does. What I've got here is a track which contains 4 separate instruments, but it's only the first one that I'm interested in order to demonstrate how compression works, and that's this drum beat. So before we actually get to see compressors in action, what we need to do is to find out what they do and why they're used so much in music. What compressors do is they change the dynamic range of the sounds that are coming into them. In other words, what we can do within a compressor is to change the balance in volume between the quietest moments and the loudest moments of a sound. Now, in a loop like this drum loop, it's actually very easy to see the loudest and the quietest moments. The waveform really helps us. We can see that there are really loud sections here, like the biggest moments or the transient hits as we call them within a drum beat. But we can also see that as those sounds tail away and we have this decay phase, we then get almost silence before the next individual hit happens. In other words, this loop is incredibly what we call dynamic. The difference between loud and soft is completely extreme, if you like. And what compressors allow us to do is to bring the distance between those quiet and loud moments closer together. And actually, interestingly, the reason why people use compression is because by squeezing those dynamics closer together, we actually get more power and energy into a sound. Let's see how that works now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Logic's compressor. And at the moment, I've got one effect on this sound already. It's an EQ, and we're going to put the compressor after it. So here is Logic's compressor. But what's interesting about the way that compression happens within Logic is that actually there are a number of different models of compressor. And the one that I'm going to choose today is the classic VCA compressor, this one here. Now, what this allows me to do to start with is to understand the basics of compression. I've got 3 main controls here. This one here called threshold, one called ratio, and this one here called makeup gain. So a moment ago, I talked about the difference between the quietest and the loudest moments of an audio file. And what we can do with threshold is to set a point between those 2 places, above which we can then start compressing or pulling down the volume of a sound. If we imagine this is the quietest moment and this is the loudest, threshold somewhere in the middle allows me to say, up until this point, no dynamic range control is applied. And above that point, we start making things quieter. And then at the last minute, we can turn everything back up to take the original volume of the loop back up to where it was and to take the quietest moments with it so that the overall dynamic range is squeezed. So let's put the threshold somewhere where we can see what effect it has on a sound. I'm going to put it here at about minus 26 decibels, which should leave the quietest moments uncompressed and the loudest moments really squeezed quite hard. That's what threshold does. The next dial is ratio. How hard do I want to make those loudest moments get quieter? How much do I want that to happen? So the higher the ratio, the more I'm pulling down the volume of the loudest bits, the bits above the threshold point. The smaller the ratio, the less extreme that volume squeeze will be. So again, just so we can understand this, let's make a nice high ratio value so we're hearing those transients being pulled down a lot in volume. And then lastly, we've got this makeup gain control, and that's going to allow me to turn up the volume of the compressed signal. Remember, the way that compression works is that frequencies or volumes above the threshold point are reduced in volume. So it stands to reason that actually, to start with, the whole sound is going to get quieter. It's only when I start applying makeup gain that I have a chance to turn its volume back up. Now then, one more thing to bear in mind before we actually hear this, which is, by default, Logic will turn on what's called auto gain. In other words, automatic gain boost. We're going to turn that off so we can actually hear the way that compression works without that automatic gain control. So here we've got a threshold, which is going to pull down the volume of the loudest bits. We've got a ratio, which is going to ensure that that volume drop is significant. And we've turned off makeup gain, which means that actually this loop should now be not only compressed, but much quieter. And sure enough, it is. You can hear that the sound sounds much more spanked. It's much tighter and it's a harder sort of sound. But because it's quieter, we're losing quite a lot of the energy from it. We're also compressing it really hard. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to put the threshold up a little bit so less of the sound is being compressed. And I'm also going to turn ratio down a little bit. We're still going to hear this. It's a nice high ratio, high enough that we're going to hear the effect, but not quite so extreme. But now what we're going to do is we're going to boost makeup gain back up, so we're actually getting all of that compressed signal, but at a much higher level. Okay, so now let's compare the uncompressed drum loop with the compressed one. Here's the original. And here's the compressed version. Now you can hear that there's much more energy and much more sort of attack now in this compressed drum loop. And part of the reason for that is because, as I said, what we've done is to bring the difference between the quietest moments in the loop and the loudest ones closer together. Now, compressors sometimes feature two additional controls, what we call attack and release time, how quickly the sound responds when it begins to be compressed, and how quickly it recovers from compression as the signal drops back below the threshold point. Now, this particular model, this classic VCA, doesn't feature an attack and release time. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch to one of the other ones now, so we can begin to see how these additional effects work. So let's come into the Studio FET model of Logic's compressor instead. Now we've got exactly the same settings as before. It's retained the settings that I had in the previous example. And even though the algorithm at the heart of this compressor will sound slightly different, those settings are retained. But what I've also now got is an attack and a release time. As I said, what this allows me to do is to control how quickly the compressor responds. As the sound goes up and moves through the threshold point, growing in volume, which remember is going to happen very quickly because the transients in this loop are so fast, the attack time will control how quickly Logic begins to compress them. Similarly, as all of those initial transients finish and we get into the decay phase of a sound and the sound drops back through the threshold point, the release time will control how quickly the sound goes to its uncompressed form. Now, it might sound like a subtle thing, but actually with attack and release times, we can make a really big difference to the way that the sound actually behaves. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop this drum part, and we'll actually hear the attack and release times changing. Again, we'll make the threshold and ratio times amounts a little bit more extreme so we can hear this more clearly, and then we'll change the attack and release times as we're listening through to see what the effect is. Now that's just the attack time so far, but you can hear the difference. Now, when we get to really long attack times, the transient actually is finished by the time the compressor is even trying to start work. So as a result, we get sort of less compression but more volume because the compressor doesn't have time to respond to the signal that's coming into it. Similarly, if the attack time is too short, we don't have a chance to hear any of the natural transient before Logic is trying to compress that sound. And it's trying so hard, we actually get this sound which is close or bordering on distortion. So a setting around here where we have a chance to hear the initial part of the transient before Logic begins to compress it is working really nicely. Now let's see what happens with the release. So now we have the mirror image, the same effect but in reverse. If the release time is too long, the compressor actually doesn't have a chance to return to uncompressed volume before the next transient comes along to send the sound back into compression. So we end up with this much more spanked signal, the signal which one way or another doesn't have a chance to go through all of its peaks and troughs. Again, at too short a volume, we end up with the compressor recovering almost too quickly and it doesn't sound musical anymore. So again, we're setting a balance between attack and release times that feels musical. Again, let's hear that in and out of context with the track overall. Let's put in the other instruments and see if we can now find a compression solution for this sound, which makes the drums really pop within the mix. So we've now got a much more energized drum part. I've kept it really compressed so we can hear that sound very clearly. But as a result of working with compression in this way, and as a result of bringing the balance between the quietest and the loudest moments much closer together, we end up with this much more inflated, exciting drum sound.